Okay, now we're recording. And now let me do this. All right, give me a thumbs up if you can hear me out in Zoom land. All right, Sam's giving me a thumbs up. Awesome. Okay.
Tim did. Yeah.
So again, welcome to the Triumph of Christianity, the pivotal 4th century. This is one of my favorite classes to teach, by the way. There's some really interesting stuff, particularly in the first couple sessions. I'm going to begin with a prologue, okay? So the city of Rome was, according to their own legends, founded in the year 753 BC, and that date's actually going to come into play a couple different times in our class tonight. Initially, again, according to kind of their legendary history, Rome was initially ruled by a series of 7 kings, okay? So you talk about the Roman Republic, but before the Roman Republic, there were kings. And the last of these, a guy who was overthrown in 509 BC, was a guy named Tarquin the Proud, okay? And I have a story to tell you about Tarquin the Proud, okay? So Tarquin was sitting on his throne, and an old woman came to visit him. And she kind of comes in, she's got a collection of books under her arm, you know, and she hobbles in on her cane or whatever. And she offers to sell Tarquin this collection of 9 books that she claims to be important prophecies about the city of Rome. And she asks an exorbitant price for these 9 books of prophecy. So Tarquin, being proud, you know, laughs her out of his office, right? Get out of here, old woman, you're crazy. I'm not paying anything, let alone this crazy amount that you're asking. So the old woman goes away, burns 3 of the books, and comes back with 6 books and offers them to Tarquin for the same price that she had offered the original 9 for. So again, Tarquin says no, but this time he's got kind of this gnawing sense of trepidation about it, you know? What's the deal with this woman offering me these books at this exorbitant price, burning 3 of them and demanding the same price for fewer books? Okay. So the old lady goes away. She burns 3 more of the books. And she comes back and offers Tarquin the remaining 3 books at the original price. Well, now Tarquin is really nervous. Okay. So he consults his priests and his augurs, tells them what has happened. And the guys are like, oh, I can't believe you did that. I can't believe you let those books get away. She's probably a Sibyl, okay? An important prophetess, okay? Whatever she's asking for the 3 books, you need to pay it. We need those books. So Tarquin buys these books, and they're known as the Sibylline oracles, okay? And these 3 books become really important to the ancient Romans, so important that they take these books and they bury them under the most important temple, the temple of Jupiter, the greatest and most important of their gods. They don't bury them, but they keep them in a vault locked away in the basement of this temple. And the Senate appoints a set of custodians or caretakers for this set of books, okay? And these are the most respected men in Roman society. To be appointed a caretaker of the Sibylline books is a great honor and a great responsibility, okay? And it's a lifetime appointment. So when one of these guys dies, the Senate appoints a successor, okay? And in times of crisis, it's the job of these caretakers to bring out the Sibylline books, and then they read through them in this ancient, forgotten language that only the caretakers are trained to read, and try and figure out if there's a prophecy in there giving instruction to the Romans on what to do at this pivotal moment in history. So when Rome gets attacked by the Gauls, for example, that's an occasion where they bring out the Sibylline books, and it's a big deal, okay? So right now you're asking yourself, Mike, what does this have to do with Christianity in the 4th century AD? Okay. All I can say is stay tuned and all will be revealed, okay? All right, so the 4th century, right? If you've been reading my little blurbs, my teasers, okay? This century, the 300s AD, opens with what we call the Great Persecution. That starts in 303 AD. The Great Persecution is Rome's most systematic attempt to stamp out Christianity, okay? And we're going to learn about that tonight. By the end of that same century, the century that began with Rome trying to stamp out Christianity altogether, by the end of that century, Christianity will become the sole legal religion in the Roman Empire. So what we're going to cover over the next 4 weeks is this pivotal century where Christianity goes from persecuted, outlawed, banned sect to sole legal religion in the Roman Empire. And I don't think I can overstate how important this set of events is for the future course of Western civilization. So tonight, we're going to talk about the Great Persecution and the conversion of Constantine. That's the first step in this transformation of the Roman Empire from persecuting Christianity to embracing it, okay? In subsequent weeks, we're going to talk about the battle for the Nicene Creed. And, you know, we've all uttered the Nicene Creed in church time again. You are not going to believe the story behind the formation of the Nicene Creed, okay? It is unbelievable in terms of the dirty tricks that are going on in the church over this seemingly innocent creed. Let me let somebody in here. We're going to talk about paganism's counteroffensive. After the Roman emperors embraced Christianity and it seemingly is taking its foothold, we get a counteroffensive by the pagans in the form of a new emperor who tries to turn back the clock, okay, and restore paganism and put Christianity back where it was. We're going to talk about the steps that are taken by the government to eradicate paganism. I call it the twilight of the gods, the last gasp of the pagan gods. And then we're going to end with that period at the end of the century where Christianity is paramount, where the emperors have kind of taken on the role of not just emperor, but also chief priest of Christianity, and how one man stands up to the emperors and asserts the concept of the freedom, the independence of the church. And that one man is St. Ambrose. So that's what we've got to look forward to over the next 4 weeks. See if I can get this to. All right. Now, for some reason, it's not showing the whole screen, but I think we can figure it out. All right, so let's get the background to the 4th century, right? We've already kind of set the stage with our story about Tarquin the Proud. We said the city of Rome was founded in 753 BC, 7 kings, 509. Tarquin the Proud is overthrown by a guy named Lucius Junius Brutus. And that event is the beginning of the Roman Republic. The Romans, after they overthrow this tyrant, Tarquin the Proud, they decide they're going to institute a new form of government, a republic where everything is decided not by one man, but by the collective body of the wise elder men of the society, the Senate, okay? The Roman Republic goes along for several hundred years. Rome builds itself an empire, but at the end of this period, it turns out that the Republican form of government is not suited to ruling this new empire that they built. It worked great when it was a little city-state, but when you're ruling half of the Mediterranean, that's a different set of challenges altogether. And we have a period of about 100 years where the Roman Republic is in turmoil. We get one powerful man after another, a series of civil wars, bloody civil wars where men are killed and their followers are executed. And it's a series of dictators, one after another. The Gracchi, Marius, Sulla, Caesar, Pompey, right? And the guy that finally puts an end to this chaos of 100 years is Augustus, okay? And one of the things that Augustus does to put a lid on this constant rivalry among powerful men is he figures out a way to gather all the power that exists into the folds of his toga while still making all these other powerful men feel like they really matter, okay? One of the things that Augustus does, he doesn't call himself king, okay? Doesn't call himself emperor, in fact. What he calls himself is princeps, which means first citizen. So he's basically saying, I'm just like you, I'm just first among equals, fellow citizens. And he maintains the facade of the Republican government. He keeps the Senate. He keeps the ancient office of consuls, which was where the power, the executive power was vested. He keeps those, okay? And he's consul from time to time. He allows the senators to continue to walk around Rome with their lictors, the guys that walk in front of them carrying bundles of rods that shows everybody, hey, here's an important guy walking around town, okay? And when Augustus wants to do something, he goes through the motions of consulting the Senate, okay? And giving them an opportunity to vote yes or no, however, he's made it clear he wants them to vote, but they feel like they've got a voice in things. And most importantly, they can walk around town and the citizens think they've got a voice in things, okay? So we get with Augustus, that's really the beginning of what we call the Roman Empire, okay? It went from the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire and the Pax Romana, okay? It's Augustus who implements the Pax Romana, which is about a 200-year period of peace and prosperity under this system that Augustus had put in place and that subsequent emperors are kind of able to keep going. But you get to the 200s, and that's when things start to totter for Rome. Historians call the middle of the 200s, the middle of the 3rd century, the 3rd century crisis. It's a 50-year period from about 235 AD to 284 AD. And we have a couple different things happening that make it a crisis, okay? Number one, we've got barbarian invasions on multiple frontiers, okay? So if the emperor is up on the Rhine defending against the Germans, okay, maybe we've got Berbers down in North Africa, or we've got Persians over in the Middle East, okay? In that 50-year period, we see no fewer than 25 different emperors. So there's no stability in government. What's happening is the army is raising up an emperor, and as soon as that emperor starts to displease the army, right, they overthrow him and they put somebody else in his place. And what happens is we start to see the empire actually fragment during this period. Big chunks of the empire break off and stop honoring or obeying the writ of the central emperor. For a while, Gaul breaks off and it's a separate entity. We've got a kingdom of Palmyra in the east that breaks off. So it's a chaotic period, and there's a couple low points that I want to highlight to give you an idea of just what the 3rd century crisis was like. It begins with the army raising to the office of the emperor a guy named Maximinus Thrax. Maximinus Thrax was a peasant in the barracks, but he was the tallest and toughest guy in the barracks. And that's what the army decided, we need this guy to be our emperor, okay? So I've got the old Guinness Book of World Records picture of the tallest man in the world, right? I mean, that would be like if we picked him to be our president because he's the biggest and toughest guy, okay? Another low point comes when Rome is at war with the Persians, and the emperor himself, a guy named Valerian, is leading the imperial troops in this battle. They lose the battle, and not only do they lose the battle, the emperor himself is taken captive by the enemy. This had never happened before in the entire history of the Roman Empire. This is a low point in terms of humiliation, and it's worse, right? After Valerian is taken captive by the Persians, the Persian king makes him act as a footstool. So whenever he sits down on his throne, the Roman emperor has to sit on his hands and knees, and the Persian king props his feet up on the Roman emperor. This is the humiliation that the great Roman Empire has come to, right, after all its glory. And this is happening in the crisis of the 3rd century. One other thing we need to understand before we can get into the meat of our story is the role of paganism in antiquity, okay? Now we come from a time and place where there's a separation of church and state. There's a hard line between the church and the government, right? It's enshrined in our Constitution. Well, that was the opposite of the way it was in the ancient world, okay? There was no separation of church and state. They were one thing. The emperor, one of his roles was Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of all the Roman religions. And in antiquity, the ancients believed that the pagan gods controlled nature and controlled events that were going on. And therefore, appeasing those gods, making them happy, keeping them happy, was a state function, right? We've got to keep the gods happy so that we can have a crop and people don't starve this year, right? So that the gods don't visit a plague upon us, right? So they support us when we go to war against the Persians. And one of the ways that the Romans did this, a state function, was something called augury. Augury was where certain special priests would divine the will, the intent, the desire of the pagan gods. And the way they did this was by reading the entrails of animals, okay? So they would cut open a goose and find the liver and look at the spots on the liver of that goose, and that would tell them what the gods were thinking. And it was at the point where sometimes the Senate wouldn't meet if the augurs opened up the goose and thought the spots were inauspicious, okay? It was a bad omen. The Senate would just go home and come back the next day, okay? So it was part and parcel of everyday life, and particularly governmental activity. Against paganism, we've got Christianity. So what happened during the first 300 years of Christianity? Well, from its origins as a teeny tiny sect localized in Jerusalem. It had grown slowly but inexorably over the preceding 300 years. And by 300 AD, Christians accounted for perhaps 10% of the population of the Roman Empire. This is the best estimate that historians can make. And it was very uneven. There were parts of Turkey, of Asia Minor, where certain towns were probably 100% Christian, right? But then you go out into the countryside and there are no Christians to be found, okay? But overall, our estimate is that maybe 1 out of 10 citizens of the Roman Empire was a Christian. And there was kind of an ambivalent view toward the Christians. They were admired for their virtue and charity on the one hand, but on the other hand, they were viewed with suspicion, right? Think back to this concept of paganism and how important it is to appease the pagan gods. You've got these Christians who won't do sacrifices to the pagan gods. They don't even believe or recognize that the pagan gods are real. So they're viewed as disloyal to the state and secretive, right? They keep to themselves. So what we see manifesting against the Christians periodically is these persecutions. And during the crisis of the 3rd century, in fact, right smack dab in the middle of it, we have one of the more important persecutions to take place prior to the Great Persecution. 247 AD is the 1000th birthday, the 1000th anniversary of the founding of the city of Rome. Remember I said it was founded in 753 BC? So you get to 247 and Romans are looking around and saying, man, our city has been around for 1,000 years. But they're in the middle of this crisis, right? The empire is fragmenting, barbarians are pouring across the border. We've got an average of an emperor lasting 2 years before being overthrown. And one guy who really feels this strongly is a general named Decius. And he says, we're celebrating our 1000th anniversary. Look at this great empire that we've inherited, this great tradition. We rule the world, right? But what is my generation doing with it, right? We're an embarrassment. And basically, Decius comes to the conclusion that the reason that things have come to this lowly state is that Rome has abandoned the traditional gods. Rome has paid insufficient attention to the traditional gods. So 3 years later, Decius himself becomes emperor. And once he's emperor, he decides he's going to take measures to redress the problems that are afflicting the Roman Empire. He orders all the citizens of the Roman Empire to sacrifice to the ancient Roman gods. And of course, the Christians, many of them refuse, and those who do refuse are martyred. He executes them. So, the Great Persecution, how does it come about? Well, again, we're on the heels of this 3rd century crisis. We've got threats east and west. We've got the barbarians coming in from Germany. We've got the Persians. We've got the Berbers down in Africa, okay? How do you solve for that problem? How do you solve for the problem of the army, whenever it gets a whim, raising some new guy up as emperor? Well, the guy who figures out how to solve this is a Roman emperor by the name of Diocletian. And this is a bust of Diocletian here. Diocletian institutes a number of reforms that we need to understand for what's going to happen with the rest of our story tonight. The first thing is he understands that one guy cannot be everywhere at once, right? I can't be both fighting the Germans up on the Rhine and fighting the Persians. So what Diocletian does is he says, I'm going to divide the empire. I'm going to have two emperors, and each of those emperors is going to have a deputy, okay? So the two senior emperors are called Augusti, okay, after Augustus, and the two junior emperors are called Caesars. So the Caesars are kind of the Augusti in waiting, the Augusti in training, okay? And to cure for this problem of the army raising and making and unmaking emperors at will, he radically changes the nature of the office of emperor. Remember, Augustus had taken the kind of humble title of princeps, first citizen. Well, Diocletian says, you know, it's easy to unmake somebody who's just the first among equals, right? I'm going to instill a sense of awe around the office of the emperor. So he does away with this title of princeps. He goes by the title of dominus, Lord and Master. And he consciously associates the office of Augustus with the pagan gods, okay? The nickname for the two senior emperors, the co-Augusti, are Jovius and Herculeus. So basically, they're kind of taking the names of the Roman gods Jove and Hercules and incorporating them into the office of emperor. Come on in if you want to listen to the class. Are you looking for something?
I'm not sure where they are. Let me go help you find them.
Yes.
Thanks, Sharon. The other thing that Diocletian does to instill this sense of awe around the office of emperor is he builds an elaborate Asiatic court ceremony, right? We think of Augustus standing there in the Senate in his toga, appealing to the senators, you know, telling them how he wants to vote. That is not how it is with Diocletian. You don't just get to meet Diocletian. It's a process, okay? He builds this elaborate palace with all these antechambers, and there's smoke filling them. There's an organ playing creepy music. You come into one antechamber and you wait, and then you get to move into another antechamber. And finally, you get to go into the imperial presence. And Diocletian is sitting there like a god on the throne. And you have an elaborate set of ceremonies that you have to go through. So it's as if Diocletian is no longer just a man, nobody that the army can simply overthrow, but he is a different kind of being altogether. So this is what Diocletian has done, this set of reforms that ends up bringing peace and stability back to the Roman Empire after it was on the brink of collapse, right? You could reasonably, as a person in 285 AD, stand in the Roman Empire and think, I'm seeing the end of the Roman Empire around me. This is the beginning of the end. Diocletian puts a halt to that, and the Roman Empire is going to chug along for another 200 years before it falls in the West. So what is it that sparks the Great Persecution? Well, we've already seen that this connection between the emperor and the pagan gods in Diocletian's regime is really tight, okay? And the spark comes when they're taking the auspices, right? When Diocletian has the priests in there, cutting open the goose, reading the liver, looking at the spots on the liver, and deciding what should we do with today's business, okay? And while this very solemn ceremony is going on in Diocletian's presence, at the back of the room, one of the augurs, one of the guys who's reading the entrails, happens to notice somebody at the back of the room do this, makes the sign of the cross. And he throws up his hands and he says, the ceremony has been tainted. We've got a Christian in the back of the room who has made this magical symbol, and I cannot conduct the auspices today. Well, of course, Diocletian freaks out, right? This is against everything that he stands for, and immediately orders everybody in the court and everybody in the army to sacrifice to the pagan gods. The next domino to fall, shortly thereafter, Diocletian is presiding over an official sacrifice. So they're sacrificing some animals to the pagan gods. And a Christian deacon by the name of Romanus inserts himself into these proceedings and tries to stop them. Tells them that they're performing something superstitious and preaches the word of God. Diocletian orders the man arrested and has his tongue cut out. And this is when Diocletian's second in command, his Caesar, a guy named Galerius, pushes Diocletian to really crack down on the Christians. It's time we stop this nonsense from the Christians. And Diocletian says, let us consult the oracle of Apollo. Now, the oracle of Apollo in ancient times is the final word. That is the most important voice or mouthpiece for the pagan gods. So they are going to the final step here. And when they ask Apollo for his position on what should be done, the answer is the impious on earth prevent Apollo from being heard. I can't give you an answer because there's so much impiety in the world. And of course, these oracles are always vague and subject to interpretation, but they interpret this to mean the impious, the impious are the Christians. And that begins the great persecution. So the first thing that Diocletian does in his first edict, issued in February of 303, is he knocks down the Christian church that he conceived from his very palace. His capital is in this Turkish city of Nicomedia, and it just so happens that there's a Christian church right up on the hill above the imperial palace. He orders it destroyed. And then he issues what he calls the Edict Against the Christians. He orders the destruction of Christian writings and churches throughout the empire. He prohibits Christian assembly for worship. Christians are denied their legal rights in a court of law. Christians in the army, Christians in the government are fired. They're kicked out. They're discharged. And Christian freedmen are re-enslaved. This is only the opening salvo. So he issues that edict in February, and pretty quickly thereafter, we get the first martyr of the great persecution, because this edict is posted in public places throughout the empire, and a Christian tears one of these down and rips it up in front of the governor. And his punishment is that he's burned alive. Shortly after that happens, a mysterious fire breaks out in the imperial palace. They find a scapegoat who happens to be a Christian, and so they scourge him, whip him, and then slowly boil him to death. And in response to these actions, what we see is that in some of those areas of Turkey, which are heavily Christian, right? Remember I said some towns were probably entirely Christian by this point. We actually see little rebellions against the government break out. And that causes Diocletian to turn the screw a little bit tighter. In the summer of 303, in other words, a few months after his first edict, he orders all Christian clergy throughout the empire to be arrested, put in jail. The imperial prison system is not equipped to deal with this volume of prisoners. And in fact, they have to kick out actual criminals, thieves and murderers and whatnot, to make room for these peaceful Christian clergy who are, the emperor himself is ordering to be imprisoned. Christianity still won't go away. So a few months later in the year, Diocletian, seeing what's happening and maybe starting to have second thoughts about what he's done, uses the occasion of his 20th anniversary. I'm celebrating my 20 years as emperor, and decides to grant amnesty to those imprisoned Christian clergy who will sacrifice to the Roman gods, right? So it's kind of a fake peace offering, right? Well, a lot of the wardens of these prisons take this opportunity to actually fake sacrifices so that they can get rid of these guys who are taking up all the room in their prison, right? So they can make room for actual criminals. And a number of Christian clergy are released by these wardens, even though they haven't actually sacrificed to the pagan gods. His act of magnanimity does not have the effect that Diocletian hopes for. The Christians are not converting to paganism in droves. So he issues the fourth edict early in 304, about a year after the first edict. And in this one, he says, all citizens must sacrifice to the gods on pain of death. And that's where we start to see a large number of Christian martyrs who refuse to sacrifice even though they know they face death. Now, as we're going to see, a lot of Christians buckle, okay? A lot of them do sacrifice to the pagan gods, and later on, they're going to want to be let back into the church, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But what is the response to Diocletian's great persecution? Well, first of all, it's enforced very unevenly, okay? Remember, the empire is divided into fourths. Diocletian's really the first of the four emperors, but in each of the quadrants, each of the tetrarchs, each of the 1/4 rulers has a lot of autonomy on how much he's going to enforce Diocletian's edicts. And so what you see in the West, particularly where Constantius is in charge, Constantius, I'll give you a spoiler, is Constantine's dad, okay? Constantius enforces it much more loosely than in the East, where Diocletian and Galerius rule. And even below that level, local officials had a huge amount of discretion. So it really mattered from town to town how much the persecution was going to be implemented. So we see it being done very unevenly, very harshly in some spots, very lightly, if at all, in others. So remember, I talked about the martyrs and the guys who buckled. Well, one of the things that Diocletian's edict was, remember, they had to destroy all Christian writings. Those Christians who handed over the Christian writings, which in Latin, hand over is traditor, okay? They were called the traditores. And we get our word traitors from the Latin word traditores, from this episode in history, okay? Those who handed over the Christian scriptures. But more importantly, no matter how much it was enforced locally, there really wasn't much popular support among the people at large for Diocletian's persecution. It never takes hold in the way that he and Galerius hope that it will. So Diocletian himself actually retires from the office of emperor in 305. This really had never happened before, but this was part of Diocletian's scheme, okay? We're going to be emperor for 20 years, and then we hand the office off to the Caesars, who rule as emperor, as Augustus for 20 years, and they bring in some new young guy to groom for the office. And this will create a perpetual, stable transition of power. This is what he has in mind, and he actually lives up to it, to his credit. He retires to grow cabbages in what is now Yugoslavia, okay? Well, as soon as he retires, everything falls apart. We're going to talk about that in a minute, okay? And people come to him and they say, you got to step back in and put this back under control. He says, oh, no, you should see the cabbages I'm growing. No way would I give this up. So he is succeeded by his Caesar, Galerius, who a lot of people think was really the guy prodding the persecution in the first place, okay? But after 8 years of persecution in 311, Galerius himself is on his deathbed. And he basically says, I'm beaten, okay? My persecution has not worked. Christianity, if anything, is stronger today than it was 8 years ago. So on his deathbed, Galerius, the guy who had authored the Great Persecution, who probably goaded Diocletian into it, issues an edict in which he admonishes the Christians. And he says, you've foolishly abandoned our tradition. I don't agree with what you're doing, but please pray to your God for my health and for the safety of the state. Isn't that ironic? Pray for me, pray to your God for me. By this point, which basically ends the Great Persecution, the persecution in the West had pretty much ended long before this. Okay, their heart was never in it, but it's 311 when it finally ends officially. So now we turn to Constantine the Great. Okay, so again, when Diocletian retired in 305, the tetrarchy, that orderly system that he had set up, quickly collapsed. Okay, Diocletian's up growing his cabbages, and he will not step back in to reassert authority. He's enjoying retirement. So now what we have, instead of 4 emperors working together, we have 4 emperors vying to be the new man, the new Diocletian, okay? One of these 4 is this guy named Constantius, and his area of authority is this yellow area, France and Britain. And so he's up campaigning in Britain against the rebellious tribes up in Scotland, presumably, and he dies on campaign. And so the soldiers immediately declare his son, Constantine, to be the new emperor of that part of the empire. So that's how Constantine comes to power. His mother, a woman named Elena, was a Christian. Now, she probably didn't raise Constantine, but certainly he was familiar with Christianity, okay? And so Constantine steps into this civil war that's going on among the 4 tetrarchs, and he's now one of the 4. He's replaced his father. And so what Constantine does is he allies with another one of the four, a guy named Licinius, who's in the east. And basically they say, let's make a truce between ourselves. And Constantine says, I will work on gaining control of the west. Licinius, you can fight your foe in the east. And then we'll figure things out when it's just two of us, right? And of course, each of them is thinking, then I'll kill you when everything is said and done. But for now, they are allies. And Constantine's opponent in the west is a guy named Maxentius. So Maxentius has the advantage in that he actually controls the city of Rome itself. And the city of Rome, by this point, is a massive fortress. It's got these awesome walls, some of which you can still see if you visit Rome, okay? So it's a stronghold that Constantine is really going to have a problem taking if Maxentius decides to hold out there. But Constantine really doesn't have any choice. He's got to go for broke. So he invades Italy. And before he makes the final attack on Rome, he will later claim that he had a vision. And while he's standing out in the field, he looks up in the sky and he sees this strange symbol, this chi rho, an X and a P, it looks to us, but the X is the Greek letter chi and the P is the Greek letter rho. And what he sees emblazoned in the sky is the words in hoc signo vinces, by this sign conquer. That night, while he's sleeping, he has a dream. And in this dream, he is instructed to paint his army's shields with this, quote, heavenly sign denoting Christ. Now, the chi and the rho are the first two letters of the word Christ in Greek. So Constantine, being a good superstitious person, obeys this dream, obeys this vision that he's had, and he has his soldiers paint the chi rho symbol on their shields. Meanwhile, Maxentius is trying to figure out what to do. I've got Constantine's army outside the gates of Rome, and a lot of his advisors are saying the smart thing to do is just sit here and let his army starve. He's never going to take the city of Rome with the army he's got. You're safe here, Maxentius. So this is where Maxentius consults the Sibylline books. Okay? He goes back to those ancient books of prophecy that have guided Rome for more than 1,000 years at this point, or 700 years at this point. Okay? And they find a prophecy that seems appropriate. And it says, on October 28th, Rome's enemy shall perish. Well, that's just a few days away. And the other thing about October 28th, that's the anniversary of when Maxentius became one of the tetrarchs. It's an auspicious date. It's a special date for Maxentius. It seems like this prophecy written in the Sibylline books is just for him. So he surprises everyone by rolling the dice and leading his army out of the walls, out of the protection of Rome, because he's confident that it is written in the Sibylline books that he's going to vanquish Constantine rather than win the easy way through a war of attrition. Well, of course, what happens is Constantine's army is victorious. And in fact, Maxentius himself, when he's trying to retreat back into the safety of the city, going across this bridge, he falls into the river and drowns. He's wearing his battle armor and he sinks to the bottom. And now the question is, has Christianity been vindicated by Constantine's victory? maybe not. So remember I told you that Constantine later claimed that it was this pre-battle vision that he had. But the funny thing is, he doesn't tell this story until a lot later, okay? And there are two different versions of this story. One is by a guy named Lactantius. He writes the first version of it. But the other one is written by Constantine's biographer and church historian Eusebius. And the interesting thing is that Eusebius writes a couple different books about Constantine. And the first book that he writes about Constantine, he doesn't mention the pre-battle vision at all. It's only many years later that he adds this story. And you would think that's a pretty good story to have in your book, right? So why didn't he mention it in the first book? Well, that's one thing that kind of makes us scratch our chin about the Constantine story. The other things that make us scratch our chin is that this Chi Rho symbol, even though it is the first two letters of the word Christ, and therefore could be construed as a Christian thing, it was not a Christian symbol. Nobody used it in the church prior to this time. So it wasn't like he was taking the cross and making that his symbol. He's taking this Chi Rho. The Chi Rho symbol was used, however, as a symbol of good luck even by the pagans. So the choice of that symbol could be given a Christian rationale, but it could just as easily be given a pagan rationale. And after his battle, after he wins this battle and becomes sole emperor in the West, Constantine builds this triumphant arch, which is still there in ancient Rome. You can see it if you visit there, okay? And it depicts a bunch of interesting scenes in his rise to power, the Arch of Constantine, but there are no Christian symbols whatsoever on the triumphant Arch of Constantine. Pretty curious if Constantine at that moment believed that the Christian God had delivered victory to him. And even after he becomes sole emperor, Constantine continues to associate himself with the pagan god Sol Invictus, which means the unconquered sun, okay? So, when did Constantine convert to Christianity? Seems to happen kind of gradually over time. He becomes more and more overtly Christian as his reign goes on. The Chi Rho appears on his coins, then it appears on his standards. He's baptized very late in life, but we shouldn't read too much into that because that was fairly common at this time, right? It was believed that when you were baptized, you were kind of given a new lease on life. And so if you were a very sinful person like Constantine, who makes his living as a soldier, killing people, okay, a lot of people would wait until the very last minute, so they had very little opportunity to commit a mortal sin after they were baptized, okay? So the question that historians have posed, and I don't have an answer for you, is, was this gradual conversion a truly, like, I'm just kind of coming around to Christianity and it's taking a long time? Or was Constantine a Christian right from the get-go, but he understood that he couldn't declare himself as a Christian right away, full force? Was it a politically shrewd way of kind of introducing Christianity step by step, piece by piece, and easing the empire toward Christianity? Again, I don't have the answer for you, but those are two alternative views of Constantine's conversion. So next week, we are going to talk about the reign of Constantine how he deals with the Christians, and we're going to get into the battle for the Nicene Creed, which has got a lot of salacious detail about the early church. Any questions about what I covered tonight?
It sounds like these days are deja vu.
Yes,
Maybe
if-
I thought of Martin Luther when you talked about the slave going and so forth.
I always make that point, that if people think, man, there was this golden age when all the Christians got along together, right? That has never existed, right? Not even back in the earliest days, okay? So what we're seeing now with churches leaving the Methodist Conference, that's nothing new under the sun.
Amazing. History repeats itself. The old adage.
Yes. Any questions out in Zoom land? Did I put you to sleep?
Oh,
No,
fascinating.
good job, Mike. Very good.
Well, we will see you next Monday for the next installment of the Triumph of Christianity. Thanks for joining.
Yay.
Thanks,
so much,
Mike.
Mike.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mike.
Great,
Fantastic.
fantastic, for sure.
Yep.
Okay, how do I get out of here?
How do I?
I don't know how to get out of
Here we
here.
go. End. Let me stop the recording.
Just out.